The first step is to print out your pattern. So it's only 5 pages here. And when you print it out, make sure that the test square is exactly 2 inches by 2 inches to make sure it was printed to scale. So the tote bag ends up being the correct size. So when you're ready to assemble the pattern, it's just trimming some of the borders in order to get the letters and the numbers aligned accordingly. So in this case, the 2 A's will come together, and then when we move to the next row, the 1's will come together, etc. So we don't have to trim every single border. It's much easier to actually leave a ledge on one page when you overlap the next page. So in this case, I'm going to leave my first page alone, and the second page, I'm just going to trim the left edge in order to get this triangle to line up nice and neatly with the triangle before it. So always use paper scissors for this, not your fabric scissors. Trim it, and then you can align the A's and all the other lines on the pattern piece. And just use some Scotch tape and dog hair to attach it. Then you'll move to the next row. So in this case, we're only going to trim the top edge, since that's the only thing that needs to overlap. And then for the last page here, we do need to trim 2 edges. We're going to trim the top and the left side in order to overlap the original papers. Okay, and the last sheet is the pocket, which doesn't connect to anything on the original pattern, so that doesn't need to be trimmed right now. So the last step will just be cutting out the outer border of each pattern piece, so we are ready to place it on the fabric. So once your pattern pieces are cut out, it's time to lay out the fabric. So just set this aside for now. So I'm going to start with my outer fabric, which will be the outside of the tote bag. And I'm using this lightweight denim here. So when we cut out our pattern pieces, we want it doubled up. So I have folded it in half across the width of the fabric so that the opposite selvages are aligned with each other, and the fold should run parallel to your selvages. And everything should lay nice and smooth without drag lines. So when we place our pattern pieces, it tells you how many to cut. In this case, it tells us to cut 2 fabric. So that means 2 main fabric pieces. And then we'll also be cutting 2 lining pieces later. So the pocket is only cut out of the lining. So when I place this on the fabric, we pay attention to the grain line arrow. So the grain line arrow always means this is how the pattern piece will hang with gravity on the finished garment or the finished product. So this will be the top of the bag and this will be the bottom of the bag. So this is how it's going to hang up and down once it's done. So we need to orient that with the strongest direction of the fabric. And we know that the selvages are almost always the strongest direction of the fabric. So that's the lengthwise grain line of the fabric, which usually has more strength to it than the crosswise grain line. So we want the grain line arrow running in the same direction as the selvages so that everything lays the way it needs to. So when I lay this on here, I can either put it up towards the fold or towards the selvage, or what I typically like to do is actually scoot my fold down to kind of reorient it so I can save a little bit of fabric. So instead of cutting it up here and then leaving a big chunk, or cutting it down here and then leaving 2 even more useless chunks, what I like to do is fold it down like this. So I'm still doubling it up enough that I can cut my 2 tote bag pieces. But now I'm saving just a bigger piece of fabric that I can use for something else later. So before I commit to this, I just need to make sure I folded it on grain. So I'm just going to do a quick check with my ruler to make sure the selvage is running parallel to the fold, to make sure it was folded nice and evenly. Okay, and then when I lay my pattern piece, I also need to make sure this grain line is running parallel to the edge of the fabric. So either the selvage edge or the folded edge here. Never measure it to the cut edge since that is unreliable. Since I cut that, it looks kind of nasty there. So we just want to make sure that it's running straight of grain. So I usually like measuring to the fold. So I'm gonna make sure this is running the same amount all the way down. And if it's not, just scoot it until it is. Okay, and always check underneath to make sure there's not a big chunk missing of your fabric or something. So you have some options here. You can either pin the paper in place. I typically don't like this because it buckles up your paper and your fabric. I prefer weighing it down. With stuff. Okay. And then you can either cut it out with fabric scissors. So you would just cut along the edge of the paper carefully. So I'm just making sure my scissors aren't leaving the ground. They are dragging against my cutting mat here. If you have a rotary cutter, you can do that instead. You can rotary cut along the edge of the paper, which is typically faster than using scissors. It's just hard to get in these corners. So you want to make sure you use scissors at those corners if you need to and not accidentally cut too deep. So always watch your other hand when you are rotary cutting, of course. Okay, so I have my 2 pattern pieces cut out. Before I move on though, there's a couple things I need to do. I'm just gonna mark these notches here. So these notches tell us where the straps are going to go on the bag later. So I just mark them by snipping into them. So wherever you see a triangle, just take a tiny snip, enough where you can find them later through both layers of fabric. So I'm not cutting the entire depth of that triangle because it's a little deep. And then this will be our pocket placement, but since the pocket goes on the inside of the bag, we don't have to worry about that right now. So I'm going to repeat for my lining. So we need 2 of our lining, but we only need 1 for our pocket piece. So in order, again, to save a little bit more fabric, I'm going to refold this. I'm also going to use this opportunity to make sure my stripes match up with each other so they're at least symmetrical on the inside of my bag. So I'm just checking underneath to make sure they are lined up the same on top and bottom. Close enough. And then my pattern piece will go there, and then my pocket will just go through the 1 layer down here. So this is my selvage. So these stripes were woven into the fabric, so I can trust that the stripes themselves are on grain. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and just make sure the stripe is running straight down the fold, and that this also looks straight here. So that will tell me it's on grain already. If you want to double check, of course, you can do the same thing of measuring to make sure it's parallel. So I don't need to mark my strap placement on the lining. I just needed to do that for the outside since the straps will be sewn to the outside of the bag. But I do need to mark my pocket placement. So you can do that with a marking tool, a removable marking tool. And I usually like to just stick a straight pin through the paper. So just at the corner dot, peel the paper back. This is disappearing ink. I'm just going to mark where the pin is poking through and then repeat that. So the pocket only goes on one side of the lining. Whoops. So I don't have to mark it on both the front and the back. I'm only marking it on this one side. And technically you would want this to be on the right side of the fabric. So my fabric does not have a right or wrong side, but if yours does, mark it on the right side of the fabric because that's where the pocket will end up being sewn. And that's why we use a removable marking tool, not a Sharpie or a pencil. Okay, that's ready. So I just need to cut my pocket. So just one layer. And I'm gonna get a little fancy. I'm just gonna cut mine on the cross grain. Just to add a little bit of interest with the stripes. But if you were doing this with a different type of fabric, you would want to follow the same grain line rules. I'm just using the cut edge of my fabric as one of my pocket edges. Again, to save fabric and to save time. Okay, there's my pocket. So you can use store-bought webbing or strap material or leather straps for your bag if you want. Or if you want to make them yourself, like if maybe you can't find the right color or the right type of strap that you want, or you just want to use up more of your fabric, then you can make your straps out of fabric. So if you choose to do that, you would want to cut 2 strips. So the length is totally up to you depending on how long you want each strap to be. And the width is going to be 4 inches here, so I cut mine 4 inches wide. The finished result will be 1 inch once it's all sewn together, which I will show you how to do. But the final strap will be 1 inch wide. So the length, mine, I think they're about 29 inches because that was the width of my fabric cut in half. The first sewing step, we're going to start with the outside of the bag. So these are my 2 outer pieces, and we want to position them so they are right sides together. So the darker side here is my right side. So I'm going to flip these around. So the little cutouts are on the bottom of the bag here. When we stitch it together, our seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. So we're going to be sewing a 1/2 inch in from the edge. So we're only sewing the 3 long edges. So we're going to be sewing the sides, top to bottom, and then the bottom edge straight across. So we are not sewing these corners. When we stitch the straight edge, we're going to stop right when we get to the raw edge of the corner and back stitch, and then we're going to hop back on here and start there by back stitching, sew straight across, stopping there, starting here, etc. So we're leaving the top of the tote bag open, of course, since that will be the opening of the bag. Pinning, I recommend 90 degrees into the fabric, spaced a few inches apart, making sure your edges stay aligned. Here are the 3 seams I just sewed. Now we need to press them open. So I like to use a seam roll. If you have a regular ironing board, you can just drape it over the pointed end of it. Or you can use a rolled up towel or something. So we're just going to press it open. So was one side seam, I'm doing the other side seam. The bottom can be a bit trickier to access. My seam roll does fit in there. If you can't get to the bottom, that's okay. You can always just kind of press it open with your fingers to make the next step easier. So for the next step, we need to box out our corners down here. So we're going to be pulling this apart and sewing at a perpendicular angle to our side seam and our bottom seam in order to create that three-dimensional boxed corner. So I'm going to reach into the side seam of my bag. So I'll have the seam running straight down my arm, and here's the opening at the bottom. So we're trying to get this seam stacked on top of the bottom seam, so they will align here. So I kind of use the fingers to help me, and you spread it open into kind of a plateau shape. And I'm just peeling this apart so I can make sure that the seam lines are aligned, and then I'm going to pin that together to hold it in place. I use 2 pins to hold open the seam allowances. You can use more, but when we sew this, we're sewing parallel to the raw edge, a 1/2 inch in. So we'll be backstitching here, sewing straight down, and backstitching at the very bottom. There's the seam. We're going to repeat on the other side. So again, I'm going to reach my arm into the side seam from the top opening of the bag and kind of pry it apart here. So these raw edges are level with each other. This seam should stack on top of the seam underneath it. You're going to squish them together. Make sure those seams are aligned as best you can, and the raw edges are aligned, and then pin it in place and sew it. There's the other seam. So I have my 2 boxed corners. I'm going to go ahead and flip it right side out. And you can push out the corners with your fingers. Okay, there's the exterior. If you're making your own straps, now would be the time to do that, just in case your thread in your machine is the same color as the outside of your fabric. So here's my strip that was 4 inches wide, and what I'm going to do is just use the iron. I'm going to fold this in half lengthwise, so it should be wrong sides together, and iron a crease right down the middle of it. Make sure your edges stay aligned the whole way down. Okay, then open that back up. Now you're going to burrito the fold. So I'm going to bring this raw edge to the center. And iron that all the way down, just along the edge. And then the other half will fold into the middle too. So usually I like to do that kind of simultaneously if possible, before scooting all the way down. And then you're going to fold it all the way in half, again, completely enclosing those raw edges. So now my folded edges should align with each other. And now I'm going to stitch that in place to hold the fold together. To sew this strap shut, I'm just going to sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the open edge of the strap all the way down. And then just to make it symmetrical, I'm going to do the same thing on the folded side, so they'll look the same. So we're not doing anything to the raw edge at the very end. We're only going to sew 2 long lines along the edges. So whether you're doing webbing, like a store-bought strap, or your own strap, it's gonna work the same way. So here's the exterior of my bag, and here are the snips that I had made to show the webbing placement. I just emphasized them with purple ink so they're easier to see on camera. But the idea is that, so you want this right side out, so this is the outside of the fabric, because we want to attach the strap to the right side of the bag. So the raw edge, so the raw open edge of the strap should align with the raw edge of the top opening of your tote bag. Pin that in place. So it should be pointing down, so edges align. And then you want to make sure that you don't twist it, so the inside fold or the inside edge should be on the inside edge on the other side. And then you'll do the same thing here, so make sure you're only attaching it to one layer of the bag. Just like that, and then I'll repeat on the other side. So the edge will align to the right side of the bag. And if for some reason you had a right and wrong side to your strap, sometimes leather straps do, you would want the good side facing the good side of your bag here. Okay, now we just need to secure those in place by stitching them on the sewing machine. So at just a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, I'm going to sew straight across at each strap. So we don't want to go all the way to our original seam allowance because we don't want these stitches to be seen later. So we want them to be smaller than the regular seam allowance so they kind of hide inside the seam once the whole thing is done. So there are the stitches holding the strap in place on both sides. To do the pocket, the first step is to hem the top edge. So my stripes run horizontally on my pocket. So if you have a direction to your print, make sure you're hemming the top edge so that you don't have something upside down. So technically we want to hem the top edge to the wrong side of the fabric. So mine does not have a distinctive right and wrong side, so I just marked an X to represent the wrong side of the fabric. So we're going to be hemming the top edge a 1/2 inch total. So we're going to be folding it a 1/4 inch to the wrong side and then another 1/4 inch and ironing that in place. So you can use a seam gauge if you have one, or a small ruler to measure your 1/4 inch. And now what I'm going to do is stitch as close as I can to this inner folded edge. So not the top fold, but this bottom fold to help hold that in place. So there's the stitch holding it in place. So now to create the rest of the pocket, I'm going to fold in the remaining 3 edges, a 1/2 inch total to each, to the wrong side of the fabric. So a 1/2 inch, but just one roll this time. So one fold to the wrong side. So that was the side, I'll do it to the bottom. So I'm gonna grab the one piece of my lining that has the dots marked on it for the pocket placement. And that tells us where the corners of the pocket go. So this is the top of my bag piece and this is the bottom because of the cutouts. So I want the hem of my pocket to be on the top, and then those corners should align with the dots that you had made earlier when cutting out your fabric. So mine ended up being a little short down here. That's okay. I'm gonna go with the top ones and pin that in place. So I'm pinning right along the edge, 90 degrees. So when I sew this, I want to stitch as close as I can to the outer folded edges of my pocket. So just the side, the bottom, and the other side. Don't sew the pocket shut from the top. So that's already been hemmed, so it's nice and neat up there. So we're just tacking it on to the bag piece itself. And this should be the right side of your lining if I didn't say that already. So this is the good side, and this would be the bad side of the fabric. So for edge stitching, I like to use an edge stitch foot. So it has this handy guide running down the middle. So it just makes it easier to line it up on the edge of your fabric to stay consistent and straight. So when I'm sewing this on to the fabric, that little guide on the foot will align with the edge of the pocket. And then I can move my needle accordingly to get where I want to be. So I'm going to change my presser foot. If you don't have an edge stitch foot, that's okay. You can just use your regular foot, and you're just aiming to sew about an 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge of the pocket. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top of the pocket, the top corner, and I'm going to be sewing down across the bottom and back up the other side. So nice strong back stitching at the very beginning and the very end. So I'm going to line up the guide on my foot with the edge of my pocket, and then I just need to move my needle over in order to actually catch the edge of the fabric. Sink your needle before lifting your foot to turn. So that will anchor it in place so it's not going to go anywhere. So there's the pocket stitched on to the lining. So now I'm going to sew the lining together the same way I sewed the outside bag together. So it's going to be right sides together. So of course the side with the pocket is the right side of the lining. I'm going to take this right side face down to line up the edges. And we're going to pin the sides and the bottom and stitch it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then box out our corners the exact same way. So now we just need to attach the outside to the inside. So we'll be stitching them together around the top opening of the bag. So here I'm going to leave my outside bag right side out, and I'll leave my lining inside out. But we want them right sides together. So I'm going to open up my lining, so the right side's on the inside here. I'm going to take my exterior bag and drop it inside the lining. So again, good sides are facing, the straps should be sandwiched in between the layers. And just kind of shift it around. You want the side seams of both bag pieces lined with each other. So I'm going to pin there first. So that's one side seam, I'll pin the other one. So that just helps you with alignment. And then pin everything else in between. Hopefully they match up. So again, the straps should be hiding inside. You don't want to be able to see them at all. Okay, so we need to sew around this entire circumference, but we need to leave an opening in our stitches so we can still flip it right side out in the end. So I like to leave the opening in my stitches between two of the straps. So you can either do it on the front of the bag or along the side of the bag. So here are my straps. So we just want to leave a gap big enough to fit your hand inside so you can flip it out later. So to mark my gap, I'm just going to use double pins. You could always use chalk or something to make sure you don't forget. So I'm going to be stitching from one side of my opening all the way around and stopping at the other side of the opening. Since we're sewing a circle here, it will be easier if you can take off the free arm of your sewing machine. So usually there's a component that you can slide off in order to access this arm, which will make it easier to sew the loop together. So again, here's my gap between the double pins. So I'm going to start on one side of the gap. We're sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance and back stitch at the beginning and the end as usual. So if you're worried about the strength of your straps, you can always reinforce by sewing over those parts multiple times. So I just did it once because this bag is pretty lightweight. If you have thicker straps like leather or your fabric's just a bit sturdier, then maybe you would want to reinforce that a bit better so nothing rips. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and flip it right side out through the opening. Carefully, try not to tear those stitches at the gap. And now I'm going to shove my lining into the bag. I'm going to trim all that later. So what we need to do is give this a nice press with the iron. So we want to smooth out the top edge so that the lining fabric kind of rolls a little bit to the inside so that you won't see it from the outside. So I kind of use my fingers to massage it in place all the way around, and then I'll just follow it with the iron. And then at this gap, of course, where we still have our raw edges, we want to roll the raw edges to the inside and try to smooth out those edges together and pin that in place. So the iron will also help you get it nice and smooth. So now I'm going to pin around the perimeter of this just to help hold the seam in place. The last thing we're going to do is top stitch all the way around the opening, which will close the gap and just hold everything in place and keep it nice and sturdy. So here's my actual gap. That's the most important thing to pin, to make sure you're lining it up properly. Okay, when I sew this, whoops. When I sew this, it's going to be visible stitching along the top edge. So I want to start at a side seam so the back stitching will kind of hide there. We don't want it right in the center front. And we're going to do a nice straight smooth stitch all the way around the entire thing. I'm going to keep the free arm on my machine, starting at a side seam. All right, I'm going to line it up with the edge of my presser foot, but then I'm going to move my needle over as well, just to get it even closer. And I like making my stitch length a little longer for this, so instead of 2.5, I'm going to make it 3. It just looks nicer when top stitching. So when you get to the straps, make sure you keep them pointing to the right so that your stitch line will go right underneath them. You don't want them folded back on themselves to make it all bulky, because we want the straps to stick up away from the bag in the end.